What's up everyone, my name is Colin, and today on the Spin Cycle we are going to be taking a look at the testing and adjustment of the throttle position sensor on a Series 4 Mazda RX-7 Turbo. Now I wanted the TPS to be the subject of my first video for a variety of reasons. The first one is, it is something that new RX-7 owners of the second gen tend to run into issues with, and it's not something that they fully understand. There is a lot of conflicting information about them on the forums and just elsewhere around the internet. The second reason is that as you drive the car, just the vibration and everything going on under the hood, they do tend to wander a bit in their adjustment and need to be looked after pretty frequently, especially as the sensors and the mechanism itself ages. Reason number 3 is that it is very easy to keep an eye on the TPS and its adjustment, and by doing so, it'll make sure that your car continues to run properly and get the fuel economy that you're meant to. Now, all Series 4 throttle position sensors are the same, be it a naturally aspirated engine or a turbo engine. This video is also assuming a couple of other things, and that is that your timing is set correctly and that your idle speed is also set correctly. These two things, coupled with the TPS, really all need to be done hand in hand, especially if you are experiencing issues with idling or just basic drivability. So, set your timing, set your idle speed, and then you can move on to adjusting the TPS. Now, if your idle speed and your timing are fine, then you can just skip ahead and go ahead and adjust the TPS if you think that that is your problem. But I'm going to show you how to actually test to see if it is your problem and whether or not your sensor is likely to be any good. So the first thing I suggest you do is go ahead and collect the tools that you're going to need in order to do this. You are going to need something to jumper the initial set coupler with. You are also going to need a flat blade screwdriver, a couple of basic sockets and or extensions, a ratchet for them, and a digital multimeter. Having a flashlight definitely helps, and I'm assuming that you have at least a basic toolkit and some understanding on how to use it. So I've got my car idling now. I did drive it not that long ago, so it shouldn't take very long to warm back up to temperature. I'm not recommending it, but I do generally do this procedure with the engine running. I came from a very cold climate, and when you're trying to adjust the TPS in the winter time, 10 below zero outside, the engine does start to cool down pretty quickly. And the reason it's so important to keep the engine warm when you're doing this is because there's a device on the throttle body called a thermowax. That thermowax has coolant circulating through it and is a wax inside of what is essentially a piston. When that wax gets warm, it is no longer a solid. That piston pushes out and acts on a mechanism that affects the throttle plates. So having the engine warm is really the only way that you're going to get an accurate reading from the throttle position sensor and an accurate adjustment as a result of that. So make sure your engine stays warm. Again, I'm not recommending that you do this with the engine running, and I'm not even going to show you me doing it that way. However, it is something that you might have to consider if it is very, very cold where you live. With a turbo, with a top-mount intercooler, you don't actually have to take the intercooler off in order to adjust the TPS, especially if you're metering it either at the ECU or on a Palm Pilot using the RTEC system. But if you are going to test and adjust the TPS in the traditional manner, the intercooler really has to come off so that you have access to the connector itself. So my engine is now fully warmed up and I can now begin the actual procedure of adjusting the TPS. Now, a couple of things that I want to touch on. The first one is the ohms versus volts debate. So if you search around on the forums or you just dig around the internet in general, you are going to find that some people are saying to adjust the TPS to a certain ohm spec, while others are saying to adjust it to a certain volt spec. The issue with this is that the ECU actually is looking for 1 volt on the pin responsible for the TPS input. I always adjust mine to a voltage spec because that is indeed what the ECU is looking for. These cars are 30 years old now and the wiring isn't exactly a spring chicken. Now this means that because of wiring degradation, the signal that you get testing at the back of the TPS, by the time it gets to the ECU, might be slightly different. So I would actually pull the carpet up, pull the ECU cover off, and back probe the appropriate pin at the ECU so that the adjustments I was making would match what the ECU needed to see regardless of the condition of the wire itself. So that's what I will recommend you do, but again, I am going to show you the generally accepted method for testing and adjusting the TPS just for the sake of consistency and ease, because let's face it, it's not exactly the most fun project to pull your carpet back, because that's when you usually find the skeletons in the closet, so to speak, be it mold or rust, and to Does anybody really want to find any of that out, or do they want to remain blissfully ignorant? I'll let you decide. If your engine is naturally aspirated, then you don't actually have to remove anything. The TPS and the connector for it are right out there in the open, and you're not going to have any problem accessing those. Obviously, guys, everything in the engine bay is going to be pretty hot considering the fact that you've just driven the car, and you really want to be careful as to what you're going to be leaning up against and what you touch during this procedure. So just use your head and some common sense, and don't burn yourself. So this little guy here is the initial set coupler that you need to jump in order to adjust the idle speed. Clearly mine is a little worse for wear. Then again, the whole of my engine bay is a little worse for wear and looks like some sort of medium explosion happened, but we'll gloss over that. You will need to jump the 2 pins in this connector to set the coupler. To remove the top mount intercooler, there are a few things holding it down. These fasteners are somewhat obvious and you should be able to figure them out no problem. As you can see, my car has quite a few things that are, we'll just use the word here, deleted, but you may still have hoses and provisions on your intercooler for stuff that I do not. If you're adjusting your idle speed on a turbo engine, the bypass air control valve has a screw recessed into this little port here, and naturally aspirated engines have this screw located on top of the throttle body, typically covered by a black rubber or plastic cap. So now that that is cleared up, I am going to remove my top mount intercooler and meter the TPS.
First.
So as you can see, I have removed my top mount intercooler and I have plugged both the intercooler inlet and outlet hoses with rags or towels in this case, just to keep anything from getting in there in case I don't know, slip and fall and a socket goes flying and somehow miraculously ends up inside the engine. That would be bad. So as you can see, the throttle position sensor is right here, and the connector where it terminates into the EM harness is right there. The adjustment screw is here just behind the alternator, which I will show you in a second. So the throttle position sensor is right here. This is the wiring pigtail that comes off of it and the connector where it terminates into the EM harness and goes elsewhere. The actual adjustment screw is right here. I'm poking it with my screwdriver. Let me see if I can get a little better shot of that. Of course the lighting is awful and so is my GoPro. But yeah, it's that guy there. Tapping it just so you know that it's that and not this there here for some reason. But anyways, so this is what we're going to actually be adjusting and this is where we're going to be metering it. Now to meter it, what you need to do is take your take your test lead probes, and you're going to be back probing. And back probing is when you take the probe itself and you insert it into the back of the connector to make contact with the terminal itself. And the ones that we are going to be back probing, let's set that there for a second, are going to be this green wire right here with the red stripe and the black wire with the red stripe. So negative terminal is going to go to the black one, and the positive lead is going to go here with the green one. So those are the two that you want to be metering. As I said, ideally you'll be doing this at the ECU, in which case I will have to look up, because I can't quite remember which plug and which wire it is at the ECU to test it there. But I'll try to find that information as I'm editing this video. This will kind of be a thing to remind me as I'm editing the video, and I'll put that in the description below. Wow, sweating like a pig. So I've got my meter set up, I've got the probes inserted into the back of the connector. As I said, you know, I don't have the ignition on right now, but I have the sensor unplugged anyway. You want to make sure that it is at least unplugged, the very least, when you're measuring the resistance to see if the sensor is any good and whether or not it has any dead spots in it. And this is because bad things can happen if you're measuring resistance when it's connected to the ECU, especially if the ECU has power. So I've purposely knocked my sensor out of alignment by a good bit just to show you guys. Currently it's reading 1.35 and my meter is set to 20,000 ohms. That's 20K with the little ohm symbol on the range for your dial of your multimeter if you're not that familiar with it. And as I move the throttle and open it up, and the cam comes off the throttle position sensor altogether, I can watch it change from the 1.34 that it is right now. Very slowly with the throttle cable, very gently pull it up, and just check that there are no dead spots or any infinity readings, so to speak, as I go up and along. Now, you really want to be able to ohm your sensor out and have it be anywhere from 1,000 ohms to 6,000 approximately. Now, generally that's more like 5,000 ohms or thereabouts. If there's anything more than 6 or 6,500, your sensor's probably going to bite the bullet pretty soon. You're going to want to replace it. They're not particularly inexpensive, but you can get lucky with used ones on occasion by testing it in this manner with it off of the car. You don't need power, obviously, just a multimeter and the right know-how. Start moving it out. This is easier to see on an analog multimeter with a needle because you can watch the sweep as you very slowly pull the throttle open and actuate the throttle position sensor. And there's no dead spots or anything happening. I am shaking like a leaf, but that's another story altogether. So being that my sensor is reading pretty high at its maximum extension, I am going to have to replace my sensor pretty soon. There really isn't any telling how long it's going to last. Currently, I don't have any issues with drivability. I don't have any issues with high RPM hesitations or misfiring. So I'm pretty safe for now, but it is something I'm going to want to change pretty soon if I want the reliability to be maintained. So now that we've tested the TPS with its ohm range and made sure that it is good, or in my case, about to fall off the face of the earth and on permanent vacation, we can now plug the sensor back in, make sure our initial set coupler is jumped and the ignition is now turned on. We're probing the same wires so the leads don't actually have to go anywhere, and I now have my meter set to 20 DC volts. As you can see with how far I threw it off spec, it is reading 0.79, so not quite a volt, and actually off by a fair amount. This would actually cause, some idle and or drivability issues if I were to leave it like this. So in order to change it, we're going to grab our flat blade screwdriver, keep this multimeter handy, and we're going to go ahead and adjust that turn screw until this reading is exactly 1 volt. Now, another thing to note is that as you're adjusting this, you're going to be pushing on that screw a good bit. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to leave your screwdriver on there as you're taking your reading as to whether or not your TPS is adjusted properly. That is because, as you notice, when you move and you apply any pressure at all, the reading on the multimeter changes. So what I like to do is every couple of adjustments, I'll just grab the throttle cable, give it a pull and let go and allow everything, all the dampers and stuff to relax and the throttle plates to relax so that it is in a natural resting position once more, and then see where my reading is at that point. Now, I'm not going to actually show you guys 1 volt on my multimeter because that's not how I set mine. Instead, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get in the car and show you on the Palm Pilot with the RX software how you can see what your TPS reading is, and then I'm going to adjust it to 20% that way. Almost died. So as I said before, I'm going to continue to adjust my throttle position sensor with the reading that I get from my Palm Pilot that is interfaced with my RTEC 2.1 ECU upgrade. And that is because, again, of any wiring issues that might be present, the degradation of the wire, this is going to see exactly what the ECU is looking at when it comes to the throttle position sensor. So it's going to be looking for that 1 volt, which reads as 20% on the RTEC. So I'm going to open up the RX-7 logger program. I'm going to go to Tune, loading, because 90s technology. Then I'm going to go down to the drop-down menu and hit ECU Setup. Now this brings up a bunch of tabs, injectors, staging, inputs, outputs, general, idle, and starting. The one we're interested in, though, is the idle tab. And this will bring up the idle setup menu, and there's going to be a blanked out checkbox, and it says set initial set coupler. Now, if I check that, that's actually going to take place of jumping the initial set coupler in the engine bay, so I don't actually have to do that. It's all done internally with the Palm Pilot and the ECU itself. So after I set the initial set coupler, it is going to advise me, the coolant temperature must be above 164.8. That's just kind of a guideline. You definitely want the engine as warm as possible. So my current coolant temperature is right where it needs to be, so that I can go ahead and hit next, which brings me to step 2. It says adjust TPS to 20%, and it gives me my current TPS reading in real time. Now I've got a pretty long cable here for the RTEC, so I just run it out into the engine bay with the Palm Pilot, and as I said, I do this with the engine running, so intercooler, everything's all still installed on the vehicle, so I keep it running. That makes sure that it stays warmed up, thermal wax isn't affecting anything, and I can go ahead and use a long screwdriver to very carefully get at, because it goes behind the alternator, to the adjustment screw for the TPS, and I adjust it until that reads 20%. So that's what I'm going to do now. Lovely job. Now that you've set your TPS after also possibly having adjusted your idle speed, you are all set to go for a celebratory drive to enjoy your handiwork. Now before you take off, just give the engine bay a quick once-over, make sure you didn't forget to plug anything in, that everything's tight, and you didn't forget any tools in places where they possibly might fall into Narnia and be lost forever. I realized that earlier I mentioned that I wasn't going to show you guys me adjusting the TPS with the engine running, yet I did anyway. In fact, if you are adjusting the TPS and the idle speed in the same procedure, as I said earlier, these two things have to go hand in hand. This is the way that you would accomplish this. This is also why I kept making references to the initial set coupler, because in order to make adjustments to the idle speed, the initial set coupler has to be jumped. By jumping the initial set coupler, you are locking the bypass air control valve down so that it does not affect the idle speed and allows for adjustments to be made. So that's going to do it for today's video. I hope that you guys enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it, and that some knowledge has been gained in the process. I've been doing the rotary thing for a long time now, and the more the information that is out there gets further and further diluted by people who are just either not quite correct or just plain wrong, the more I want to make these videos so that people can keep these cars on the road for many years to come. Additional information will be posted in the description below. Please like or dislike the video and give me some feedback as to why either way. And if you're new, please consider subscribing, as it's really going to help me out in the future. As time goes on, I'll be able to make more of these videos if there is enough interest for them.